Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with Rudy Rivera. And I have a question. Yes, the recording will be available later. I am thrilled to talk about debunking pharma myths and the affordable healthcare with two. It's very refreshing to see Gen Zs have a passion for caring and wanting to change the world. We have Neda Ashtari, Megan Curtin, and Allisun. Allisun, I've only got your first name on there.
My last name is Wiltshire.
Wiltshire, okay. So we're going to, first of all, I want to welcome everybody. We are broadcasting live on LinkedIn. We're broadcasting on YouTube and Twitter, as well as recording with our Zoom audience. So welcome and thank you for agreeing to come on my show. Before we really get in, I'd like to have each of you tell me a little bit about yourselves. We'll start with you, Neda. Tell us what about you and why you're doing what you're doing.
Sure. So happy to be here. My name is Neda. I'm a fourth-year medical student at UCLA, incoming Yale internal medicine resident. And I am here because I'm very passionate about drug pricing in this country. I have been personally affected by the cost of drugs, as my entire family has also been. And, I kind of based off of what happened to me earlier in life, which was, my family experiencing a lot of financial hardship, fighting my mom's cancer for 12 years. I was motivated to kind of dedicate my life to this issue of high prices. And it's something that we see every day in medicine. It doesn't exclude anybody. So it's a really important issue that I think we can all get behind.
Well, illness and death no one escapes from that.
Exactly.
You may have an afterlife, but we're all going to get there at some point or another, which is why this topic is extremely important, especially somebody getting my age up in years, right? Megan, tell us about yourself, and then you, Allisun.
Hi, I am a fourth year at UC Berkeley studying molecular and cell biology, and I am hoping to pursue medicine. I really want to address issues and disparities in healthcare, and my family has also faced financial hardships and, alcohol abuse from, years of there being like abuse in like the Catholic Church. And so I just want to kind of face systems of oppression and try and make the world a better place by bridging the gap and disparities where they exist in medicine and accessing medicines.
Allisun.
So I'm also fourth year at UC Berkeley studying molecular and cell biology. We both joined our freshman year to this organization that we're talking with you today about. And what motivated me to join was that my father has had a chronic illness since I was 5 years old. It's a movement disorder. It's similar to Parkinson's. He's since been diagnosed with another chronic illness, and I couldn't imagine us not having the healthcare that we do. And the access to therapeutics and drugs that he needs for his illnesses. So it's something that is really personal to me to make sure that with everyone's individual illnesses and with what's going on in everyone else's lives, that they have access to the drugs and all the various therapeutics that they need as well. So it's been really impactful to get to do advocacy work in this sphere.
Well, that's great. It's very refreshing to see people who care about want to change the world. Neda, the title of our conversation is Debunking the Myths, Pharma Myths. What are some of the myths?
Yeah, so there are a few things that pharmaceutical companies repeat over and over that have become kind of common culture, I think. The first of which is using scare tactics, such as, if we lower drug prices, everyone will die because there will be no more innovation. So I think that's the first myth.
Okay.
I think the other myth is that drug prices correlate with innovation and with actual clinical benefit or value of drugs, which is also not the case. Another thing is that we in the US shoulder the cost for the rest of the world. And if we were to pay lower prices, then the rest of the world would suffer. But in reality, I don't think anybody in the world can afford drug prices. In other countries, they don't have it easy either. And then I think when we're talking about things like why the costs are so high, oftentimes again, they point to innovation, but it's actually just innovating the ways that they extend their patents. So that would be, I think, another myth. So there's really just that basic issue of linking research and development to the cost of drugs. That is the pervasive myth, right? That is the thing that scares people the most. And then there's a bunch of baby myths below that. So
let's talk about these myths first, though.
Mhm.
All these myths are designed to keep the prices high, in other words.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that they say is that the cost to develop a drug, starting there, is $2.6 billion. And so this number comes from a study that was conducted by Tufts Center for Study of Drug Development, and it has several flaws. The first of which is that the study was funded by pharmaceutical companies.
Correct.
So that's obviously a big conflict of interest. Its analysis was also not transparent at all. So we don't know where they got this number. We don't know what companies they looked at, and we don't know what types of drugs were included in the analysis. And then another issue is that half of that $2.6 billion came from
From universities, taxpayer money.
Not quite, but that's a different part.
Okay.
So it came from theoretical loss on earnings. So not actually money that they spent, but theoretical losses.
Okay.
And then the last thing being that it doesn't include the NIH funding and the Department of Defense grants that actually are responsible for the vast majority of innovative drugs that come to market. So in reality, studies place that number close between 19 million to 44 million, but it's not it's not even close to 2.6 billion. And then another thing would be that price increases don't correlate with increased R&D spending. They correlate with the amount of money that goes back to shareholders and buybacks. So a 2021 House Oversight Committee report found that companies spent many more billions of dollars on padding their own pockets through these dividends and buybacks compared to how much they spend on research and development. So estimates say that pharma actually spends less than 8% of their revenue on research and development, and 3 times as much on marketing and advertising that they do compared to research and development.
Well, that's a question, though. I see a lot of advertising.
Yes.
That you have to go to your doctor. And I mean, it seems like it's more constant than ever. Ozempic, Numera, all these other things are advertising it. And I just have to think and wonder, they should be advertising to my doctor, right?
Oh, they are.
They're advertising to me so that I can go to the doctor and say, I want this medicine, right?
Yes. I mean, trust me, they're also paying doctors. About 50%
sure.
of doctors in the US take money from industry. So
So 3 times the cost is for marketing.
yes.
And so my question is, do they really need to do the marketing?
Well, if the drug works, no, right? I mean, nobody needs to market for insulin. We need it. The doctor knows you need it. You know you need it. But if something doesn't have clinical benefit, if something isn't better than what's already on the market, then yes, you do need to spend heavily on the direct-to-consumer advertising, which only the US and New Zealand allow.
Well, I took a survey. Which of the following is not a reason contributing to the high cost of drugs?
Mm-hmm.
A complex marketplace with many people involved who each take a cut of the profit. Okay. I feel like this is a law school exam question, A, but not B. Okay.
Right.
High marketing and advertising budgets.
Mm-hmm.
And C, clear information shared with consumers that prove name brands are better than generic versions.
Yeah.
Right.
Hopefully. What do people say?
Well, no, this was my survey I took and put.
Okay.
And this is basically, they complex marketplace, yes. A bunch of middlemen, definitely yes. Okay. High marketing budgets, definitely going to add to the cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
But clear information shared with consumers that proves name brands are better than generic versions, that's also something that adds to the cost, right? Because if you've got a drug that's the same, but there's a generic version, and I've actually seen this at the pharmacy where people say, no, I don't want the generic drug. I want the name brand drug.
Right.
And that's what they do, right? So those are all the things that add to the cost of the medication. That's why. How do they propagate these myths, though? They have
they have a huge budget. They have a budget that doesn't even compare to our UAM, Universities Allied for Essential Medicine's budget. And so it's hard to compete with that. And they also have their hands in the way that our government works. And it's just it penetrates everything, really. So from the moment you start medical school, these pharmaceutical companies are sponsoring the textbooks. They are sponsoring the continuing medical education conferences. They're writing the guidelines. Over 60% of clinical practice guideline authors receive money from pharmaceutical companies. So it goes far deeper than just direct money to doctors. But all of these things contribute to the really high cost of drugs that actually don't have any benefit. And kind of to give you a statistic that's really troubling, there was a study that showed that over 74% of drugs that came to market in a year only did not even extend life by 1 day in cancer patients. So 74% of FDA approved drugs. And we often don't take those drugs off the market. We just let them sit there because the FDA doesn't take any regulatory enforcement actions to get them off the market. And when they do, and something bad happens, it takes on average 4.2 years for those safety concerns to come to light and to be taken off the market after.
So they can't be taken off the market, right? And so they're stuck. It's just another profit center. They've already gone through the R&D. It's just there that somebody can prescribe. It's a cash cow, right? That continues to generate, even though it's not working.
Yes.
To me, is the bummer in all this. You've got a drug out there that people think is working, but it's not. Megan and Allisun, what do you think about this also?
On Neda's point about the FDA, I'm also part of a transparency team with UAM, and we work specifically investigating the FDA's enforcement of a law or an amendment from 2007 explicitly requiring them to ensure that clinical trial sponsors are reporting their results of, NIH publicly funded clinical trials. And what we found is that over 5,000 trials that have been publicly funded are not in compliance with the law. And this is really troubling in terms of safety, to not have full result reporting. We wrote an article in MedPage Today last month regarding an FDA citizen petition that we wrote asking the FDA to kind of change their enforcement, or more so enforce better the existing law.
Yeah, I've been learning a lot about the work with the FDA and that they're just really not enforcing their own laws, which is really surprising that they even have the law if they're not going to use it. So it's been really interesting to see us getting the word out there and getting publications to pick us up about what the FDA could be doing and actually taking action and causing these people to take the action that they should be doing the whole time.
It's also
a $1 million question, though, is if they don't work, why do they get FDA approval?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to speak to that. So there are a variety of mechanisms that these drug companies use to push their drugs to market. One of the tactics is conducting biased clinical trials, and they do this in a number of ways. One example is that in our FDA, they are not allowed to mandate that companies compare a new drug to what is already on the market, or the gold standard. So this would be called a head-to-head trial or an active comparator trial. Every other country's FDA regulatory body does, because we want to know, is this drug actually better than what we already have, or is it simply more expensive and increasing your profits? Our FDA does not do that. And so essentially these companies are comparing a new drug to a placebo, or that means a drug that doesn't work at all because it's let's say a sugar pill or something like that. And then another way that they do this is they pick inappropriate patient population. So let's say you're talking about melanoma. So there have been studies in melanoma where the actual people who get melanoma are usually elderly patients, but then in the trials, you'll have younger groups of patients overrepresented, which of course will have better health outcomes when you test that drug compared to the older patients who are more frail and have other health conditions. Another way that they do this is by using inappropriate endpoints called surrogate endpoints. So surrogate endpoints in clinical trials are essentially supposed to correlate with clinical endpoints, which are overall survival or a patient's quality of life. So what we want is to see that a drug that costs me $100,000 a year has some benefit to my quality of life, or is able to extend my life by 1 or 2 months. But surrogate endpoints are things like progression-free survival, which is a term that basically means your cancer has not necessarily progressed for a certain time period, but it doesn't mean that it's extended your overall survival. So they'll use these surrogate endpoints that don't actually have any clinical meaning to patients. And they'll, like, let's say an example would be the number of days that you woke up without a headache, which is not really something clinically meaningful for somebody who suffers from cancer. And then they will basically prove that their drug has benefit using these endpoints through this accelerated approval process at the FDA, which is a very lax method of approving drugs that is also being played because the accelerated approval process was supposed to bring drugs to market for which there was immediate need to treat a disease. Actually, the time of HIV is when FDA started to use accelerated approval. But now companies are saying, well, there's an immediate need for another arthritis drug. And so they're bringing these drugs to market using random clinical surrogate endpoints. And then once they're on the market, like Megan said, there's no obligation for them to actually do the follow-up trials or post-marketing surveillance. And then they stay on the market, and the companies profit and the patients suffer.
Yeah.
Well, so you go ahead, Megan, go ahead.
I was just going to add, the FDA, the law that is in place that isn't being enforced, they could take fines from these different clinical trial sponsors, but they've never levied a fine against them. There's actually a website called Clinical Trials Tracker, and you can go on there and see that to date, amount of money that the FDA or the government could have imposed against clinical trial sponsors, and it's $45 billion of American taxpayer money. So
it's interesting because, the government goes out to fight corruption, and they're fining companies for violation of Corrupt Foreign Practices Act, those kinds of things. The fines are in the millions, but you don't see very much in the way of fines with the FDA.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason for that, and it's because the FDA advisory board members are also paid by pharmaceutical companies. So I'm probably creating a lot of conspiracy theorists here, but it's not a conspiracy theory if it's real.
Well,
and they're paying them off.
Well, there's an interesting person. I was looking at her TEDx talk. Her name was Ellen Hohen. She's Dutch. Okay.
Yeah, she works with UAM.
And she, proposed an interesting theory. She says one of the things that keeps the drug prices high is the hold that the pharmaceutical companies have on their patents. Okay. And the patents have a certain period of time, but the patents keep getting modified. So you add another mixture, you add how it's dispensed, all those things keep the hold on it. And she gave two examples. She's, before the World Trade Organization set up a standard of setting up treaties throughout the world on the patents in the pharmaceutical industry, India made a generic drug for HIV, I believe. And the price went down because of the competition. So what this lady's saying is competition is good. And what they should do is take these patents and make the company share the information like they did in the aviation industry. Wilbur and Albright had patents, and they were protecting their patents. The government says, no, we need aviation. Everybody, you got to share your patents, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right
now, sorry, go ahead.
You think that's a solution too?
Definitely. I mean, right now, I think, over 74 patents per drug on average. So it's not one patent, one drug like it was meant to be. They're patenting things like the formulation, just like you said, combinations of things. things that, again, have no real clinical benefit at all. But they're using these tactics like evergreening and thicketing are ways of basically suing generic companies so that they can't introduce their drugs to market. So there are all these different legal mechanisms and loopholes that that they're spending their R&D money on to extend their patents.
And the R&D money is legal fees. It's also marketing. It's these clinical trials that are supposedly paid by the taxpayer in some cases, right?
Yes.
Funded by universities. She suggested the medical patent pool.
Medicines patent pool, yes. So they work with us at UAM, and they're great because they essentially help extend licenses for really expensive drugs in low and lower middle income countries. And I think actually are going to be helpful to us in the United States also. Megan will tell you about that later, but she's been working to make drugs more affordable here in the US by working with the medicines patent pool.
We'll get into that a little later in the in our talk, but I think this thing's fascinating because it opens up eyes. I go to the pharmacy to get medicine. Okay, some medicine I'll pay $300 for, and some I'll go to another pharmacy and pay less. Right. There was a special. A friend of mine was getting a specialty pharmacy. Okay, and the medicine, even with insurance, was $250. Yet you go to GoodRx and that same medicine at a grocery store is $50. And so I couldn't understand, why is there a disparity in pricing? And I guess it has to do within that complicated maze of who's buying when and where and in what quantities. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, there's nothing intrinsically linked to the price of medicines from region to region in the United States. Even within a certain city, certain pharmacies will have wildly different prices. And I also think it's criminal that pharmacists don't tell everybody about GoodRx, because I've been in that situation where I show up and I ask for my medication. They'll say it's $200, and then I'll show them the GoodRx and they'll say, okay, now it's $3. And I'm like, were you not going to tell me?
Well, you would almost think the pharmacist is, maybe he doesn't care, or maybe
I don't know.
They have to do sales. We have a question for the panel. How do we reconcile the cost problem of the American system, such as sky-high prescription drug prices, with the access problems of systems such as the Canadian and the British National Health System? I am also from Wisconsin, and former Governor Tommy Thompson's Badger Care program has done well for low-income individuals. As a panel, have you heard of the Badger Care?
No.
Then I'll ask the person who asked the question to just type something in to tell us what it is, because I've not heard of it. So those are the primary myths of the pharmacies, and so they're spreading that information. Is your position, and I think I agree with you. It's that being in the pharmaceutical industry is very lucrative. Yes.
And just to sort of answer part of that person's question, in terms of how do we deal with this issue of, I know what they're referring to in terms of Canada. You see all these videos of people saying, well, we have universal health care, but we can't get an appointment for 9 months or something like that. And the truth of the matter is, we don't have better access here. So we're not doing better than Canada. We have better access to worse drugs or more expensive drugs. But actually, let's say the UK is nice. They consider cost effectiveness when they're granting a drug approval. So just because you don't have access to a very specialized drug, let's say a biologic that's very, very steeply priced, does not put you at any kind of advantage or disadvantage. You don't need access to a bad drug that's going to rob you. You need access to cost-effective drugs, which we don't have here in the US, and they have equally as much access as we do.
Well, the revenue from the pharma companies is astronomical. In some places, gone up even 500%.
Yes,
and part of that, if you look at the pandemic, there are people that get the impression that all these pharmacies are cooperating, but they're getting paid for what they're doing. I don't know. Are there any freebies out there?
No.
Somebody's paying for it, right? Somebody's
Yeah.
paying for it, and somebody's getting the money. But there's one of the big pharmaceutical associations is Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America Association. They're probably the biggest, right? Or one of the
Yeah.
biggest.
That's
'Cause
pharma.
Yeah, these are, I mean, I'm looking at the number that they are throughout the world. There are a lot of them. Okay.
Mhm.
But this is the most powerful one. And right now they're trying to block specific pricing, set pricing for health insurance or whatever, because they say that that will lead to, right, a decline in research and development. It basically hurts you. That's the scare tactic you're talking about, right?
Mhm. Yes.
And it's interesting. They've been around since 1958.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And I noticed that a number of the heads are former pharma execs, right?
Yeah, and you have this revolving door of the pharma execs and the FDA execs just kind of switching out, and lots of issues to be said about that as well.
Well, I think that that's not uncommon, but you have people from industry. What barriers are there? So importing large proportion of our pharmaceutical generics from established companies and other, well, I got to read this here carefully. What barriers are there to importing a large proportion of our pharmaceuticals as generics from established companies in other nations, e.g. India, Canada, Ireland, etc.?
So there are legal barriers because pharmaceutical companies have used scare tactics to say that if you go to other countries and they have sketchy regulatory bodies, their FDA is not as good as our FDA, and their drugs are made with God knows what, which is entirely false, because we already get the majority of our drugs from other countries, and there's no difference in how effective or how pure these drugs are. It's just another scare tactic that they use. I actually worked on a bill to import drugs from Canada and other countries when I worked in the Senate, and had to sit there and listen to this idea that the other FDAs are not equivalent to ours, and the whole innovation argument. But again, it's a legal barrier. If the Trump administration said that they were going to allow it, they put a few rules into place. But at this point, there's issue at the state level for importing drugs, because it not only needs to be federally approved, but also approved by the states. And that's where we're tied up right now.
Well, I think we've got some really great questions here. So that's why I'm kind of deviating a little bit. I would like to know, what are the panelists' opinion on the role the pharmaceutical industry played in containing the COVID pandemic? That's a broad question, but maybe I can ask them to clarify it. When they mean their role, I mean, they developed the vaccine, right? They were working, in theory, night and day to develop vaccine. Were they sharing information? I don't know.
No. I mean, Megan, do you want to speak to this?
What I'll say is it's amazing how there has been such a long historical conversation about not being able to work together, and that, it would deter innovation. And then, some people were more so on the side of, we're not going to communicate, but then there was forced collaboration, and look at how fast you get a product. At the same time, industry really wanted to protect their rights. These vaccines that they were making, they wanted them to be priced quite high, and it required government intervention to be able to make sure it was affordable, within the US. And so we see that the government has the power and capacity to do so with other medicines. So it'd be interesting to see if this policy, would apply more broadly, because we know it's possible. It happened within the pandemic. But now we have these very powerful, even more so powerful companies with all the funding from the government for producing all the vaccines. Yeah.
So the funding from the government's buying, right? The government's buying this stuff. So even though I can get tested 20 times, it's free, somebody's paying for it, basically. Or if I get the COVID shot. Allisun, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to follow what was going on with the TRIPS waiver with the Biden administration, just seeing how our government was interfering with that, with pharmaceutical industry, and how we could get the vaccine to other countries. And the fights that were going on with that. And not just getting the vaccine to other places, but also allowing them to produce them themselves and getting them the infrastructure that they needed was a really interesting point of the pandemic, something that was brought up.
Well, do you think they made a lot more money because of the pandemic? I mean, all that R&D wasn't free, right?
Well, it was funded by us, just as all their
Right.
other R&D, and
It wasn't, but it wasn't free to, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't, in other words, they didn't do it for free. They got paid for it one way or the other.
Exactly, yes. And
Mhm.
and they were very, very they were not going to share their patents. I mean, we had to fight really hard for that. And that's why, actually, I would say pharma kept the pandemic going longer than it would have been if they had shared their intellectual property, because when the rest of the world doesn't have access to vaccines, it doesn't help Americans to have access to vaccines, because that's not the way that infectious disease works. So you just need one person from another country who's unvaccinated to come here, and then the disease keeps going. So actually, it was a global issue that they were blocking the production of vaccines elsewhere, and probably prolong the pandemic.
That's interesting. That's something you don't hear about in mainstream media. We do have another question, and we'll get on to your program at UCLA, and that is, what business model does GoodRx follow to make a profit while apparently lowering prices in most pharmacy chains?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm happy to look into it and send information after.
Okay. I think what the pharmacist has told me is that it has to do with which group is buying at the time and the quantities you buy and what's not been sold. So if you've got this excess and somebody's willing to offer you rather than just not do anything with it, because I think the medicine still has to have a marketplace, right? In other words, somebody still has to be sick. And if, let's just say, disease drops a certain point in time, you're not gonna be selling the medicine, right? So that's what I understand it to be. But yeah, this is something I saw Martin Sheen advertising on TV. Somebody said, GoodX also has your data, which translates into money. So as you have to sign in, they've got this information where they're selling you stuff, and data is probably just as important. Maybe that might be a factor. Although now there is a monthly charge. You can get into the monthly charge to save even more. So I think it started off as free. Now it's a subscription service, right?
That's right. But you still can use it for free. You just, like you said, you save more with the plus subscription.
Yeah, I just hope I don't get sick. That's all I hope.
We will all get sick. So sorry to break it to you.
Well, some of us will go right away. Okay, others will go after prolonged.
One can only hope.
I know. I like to go smoking a cigar in my sleep, or smoking a cigar, and all of a sudden I finish it, and then I just lay back and they take me.
That's the dream.
You're too young to remember Sanford and Son. Elizabeth, I'm ready. You know?
I don't get that, but sounds funny.
So Megan and Allisun, tell us about the program you're doing at UCLA and how you think that will help the population in the United States.
I think it would be better if Neda spoke to this, because we are working on a really impactful project at Berkeley, but we are kind of working based off of the work that Neda started at UCLA.
Well, why don't you tell us about your program at Berkeley, then we'll have Neda come on in and.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the elephant in the room that we haven't really discussed yet is Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is the organization we are all from. UAEM for our acronym. And we are a health justice organization aimed at working with universities to increase access to their medical innovations. Because, publicly funded institutions are kind of the crux of most innovation within the US. And we think that being students, we have a voice at these schools to be able to talk about how these medicines should be accessed within the US and abroad, including how they're priced. So I joined UAM in 2019 because I thought it was really wonderful to hear about other students who were able to create change at a higher level than most people our age are able to. And to be an advocate for something so big as, disparities in healthcare seemed, like a very lofty thing that was intangible to someone who's like 19 years old. So it was very interesting to be able to learn more about the work that was happening at Berkeley and also become part of the national team. And maybe you can talk a little.
Yeah, I joined in 2019 as well. We both joined as freshmen. And there were a lot of clubs at the time that were like marketing themselves to pre-meds. But this was the one that we felt could have the most impact on a campus like Berkeley that's producing so much research, so much technology. It's just endless how much is going on campus. And when we joined, it was when CRISPR was just like coming out as getting the Nobel Prize in 2020.
Maybe we should talk about what CRISPR is.
Yeah, so CRISPR is a gene editing technology. It's become really interesting recently for therapeutics, such as with sickle cell. But it delves into a lot of different areas with like agriculture as well. And our campus has Jennifer Doudna, who works right next to campus in the Innovative Genomics Institute. And in 2020, she won the Nobel Prize for the CRISPR gene editing technology. So just hearing about that in the news going on our campus, we thought that this organization could be a way to impact those technologies and other technologies coming out of Berkeley and make sure that people who need them are getting access to them. And since we're students here, we have a voice in seeing that through.
So you're trying to influence university policy to be more proactive in making sure that the general public everyone has access to healthcare, not just the very wealthy. And
right.
Yeah, I can say, that in, for example, I've traveled in a number of countries, and I noticed that healthcare in some countries, if you don't have the money to pay, they're not going to treat you. They won't even take you in to stabilize you. And you have to pay a deposit. So it's it's sad. So at least here we've got some vehicles, right? They have to treat us. They have to do something. It may not be the best care, but we do have to get treated. So the program that you and Allisun are working in at Berkeley is a program that Neda started at UCLA.
Right.
And how many universities are involved in that now?
So it's growing quite quickly, but maybe we'll just talk a little bit to kind of why we felt that we wanted to change the existing policies at Berkeley. So Berkeley has been, around, in terms of being an advocate for change since the 60s with the free speech movement. And so our campus kind of touts themselves as leaders, not only in research, but also in, public benefit. So we wanted to kind of look into what existing policies were in place, and we met with campus administrators, researchers, to learn about what the technology transfer licensing landscape looked like. And we learned that there is a socially responsible licensing program in place, but it's limited. And it was implemented in 2003 on our campus, and maybe you can talk about some of the limitations.
Yeah, so this is something that was implemented in around 2003, like Meg said. It was promoted by one of the researchers on campus who was interested in neglected disease research. She made this diagnostic tool for dengue fever and wanted to make sure that that was something that would be accessible for the countries that need it. So she spearheaded that, and then we've been looking into that and seeing how in 2023 there are things that could be adapted onto that to make sure that companies are being more proactive and they're not just waiting for things to pop up as issues with access. So we can talk more about how our plan that we're promoting now will supplement that. I don't know if you want to add any more limitations as well.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Another issue that we found at Berkeley, and I think that pervades other universities, is just transparency. To know what your university is doing is not a common thing. Most universities have almost nothing about how they license their therapeutics. And our campus had some information about it, but it seemed like it was a decade out of date. And we were unsure if that was because it hadn't been implemented or if they just hadn't updated the website. And so we also wanted to address transparency as, a part of what we were hoping to change. Yeah.
So basically it's this university is like a car that's been in the garage for a while, maybe works sometime and doesn't work, and you're trying to get it up to speed to really do what its mission statement was, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It had its mission statement, right? But now you are making sure that they do it, okay? That healthcare is available for anybody and everybody, right?
Right.
And why? So you're starting at the university level. What I see for maybe two reasons. One, a lot of the young doctors are coming in. You're indoctrinating them, correct? That's important. If the pharma companies can do it, you should be able to do it, right? And two, I guess you want the hospitals or the universities to carry out their mission statement.
Right. As students, they have an obligation to hear us out and meet with us. Like we went to our office hours for our chancellor. Since we're students, she was obligated to hear us out and hear what we had to say, and it led to a lot of promising conversations.
I just also want to add, I think that the number one reason is because you can look at downstream solutions like price control at the pharmacy counter, right? But ultimately, like you said, somebody pays for that. So it's really whatever the list price of a drug is, that is what determines how much our health system suffers. Whether we pay it at the pharmacy counter or not, we're going to pay it in the form of deductibles and copays to our health plan because they're not going to lose their piece of the pie. So really the solution is looking upstream. And the upstream solution is at universities where the basic science research is happening. And so every year we spend about $40 billion and we give it to 2,500 universities in the US to conduct this basic science research. So they're the ones in the labs, they're the ones coming up with the actual innovative phases of research, that risky part of research. And then what happens is biotech companies come to the table when we know that something already works, and they buy the license to that drug. And then they sell it to Pfizer, and then Pfizer marks the price up 6 times. And then we have what we have now, which is the list price that is unaffordable for anybody to pay. So what we're trying to do is say that right at that initial negotiation, when biotech comes to the table with our university, there needs to be a mechanism in place to ensure that affordability is part of that discussion rather than an afterthought, rather than something we think about when it finally gets to the counter and everybody is dying because they can't afford the drug or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive to business because when you go on a business deal, the whole goal is to make as much money as you can. Okay, I want to make as much money as I can. I want to sell the most insurance I can. I want to do whatever. But we're talking about basically the public good, and that has to be factored into as well as a business. I mean, the Daughters of Charity used to have a great slogan: "No margin, no mission." If you don't make any money, you can't do the good deeds, right? So I think what you're pushing is you're making all this money. Let's see the good deeds, right? Let's see other people benefit from these deeds.
Exactly. And they are making their profits in the first few years that the drug comes to market. So, sofosbuvir for hepatitis C, which was made by Gilead, that's a great example. Between 2012 to 2014, Gilead spent like $880 million on the development of this drug. And by 2018, their sales had recouped costs by 57 times. So it's not like they are not immediately making back all the money they put in. We're saying you should have profit. You helped, you contributed to something good. Nobody's denying that. But it shouldn't be to the point of profit where the entire rest of the system is suffering and people aren't actually able to access that public good that you made or helped.
Well, this is something I'm not sure of, and I'm hoping you to enlighten me on this. So is the license generally given to one company or is it given to multiple companies?
So it's usually so patent and license are different. So the patent is not traded between companies. Right,
that I get it. But the university gets the patent, right?
Yes.
And then they're going to license it. Do they send it to one person? Do they just say, okay, ABC pharmaceutical company, you've got the license for this? Or do they give it out to more than one company?
So it's usually one company, and it's usually a very like small startup biotech sort of company, and then they can sub-license it or sell that license to another company. So there can be a number of companies involved at any given point with different responsibilities like marketing, advertising, etc. But it is usually one company initially that comes to the table and the license goes to.
And so then in essence, they would have the monopoly, right?
Yes, exactly.
At that point, then they can charge whatever they want. So do you think a solution would be then to say, well, we're going to license it to ABC startup, but we're also going to license it to DEF startup too?
That's called non-exclusive licensing. And it would be a great thing to do, but it is not anything that any company has agreed to do. But yes, I mean, that is the ideal. We should be using non-exclusive licenses.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with licensing, trust me, but that's, you got exclusive and non-exclusive rights, and so I can see them at the table saying, well, wait a minute, we're going to invest the X amount of money, whatever it is, okay, and we're going to market it. We want the exclusive to this because we're not going to spend it so somebody else can take it, right?
Right.
At a certain point in time.
Right. And we've tried march-in requests, like where we've tried to get the government to say, you can't exclusively license this drug. You need to allow for other generic companies to make it. And those have failed. So our government has never granted a march-in rights request.
And of course, the generic is always cheaper, but even then, that's not always so. You still end up paying a high price for generics too. So people think the solution is generic drugs, but they're the high markups on the generic drug too, because there are all these middlemen. There's also the lack of transparency. Isn't that correct?
That's very correct. In recent years, there's been a skyrocketing in generic drug prices as well.
I was talking with Megan and Allisun earlier about, aspirin, how long ago it was developed there, and it wasn't even licensed the proper way back then. The government didn't have the procedures they have now, so that's a cash cow. The gift that keeps on giving, right? We have another question and by the way, we've got people from Mexico, we've got somebody from Europe taking an interest in this. In your opinion, is it possible a balance between drug patent protecting and accesses to medicine? With no protection, research will disincentivize and their work also against new cures and treatments. I think the question he's asking is, does the lowering of the prices or is it going to disincentivize research? Is that how you understood the question also?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I think they were asking. And I think, yes, it is definitely possible to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to research and bring new drugs to market while also making sure that these things are accessible. And the issue is that we need to close the loopholes. So we want patents to only last as long as they're supposed to last, which is 20 years at most. But, we've seen with insulin, there are 3 giants who have a monopoly on this drug, and they've been extending their patent through making different formulations, et cetera, new forms of insulin that aren't actually really more useful than what we already have. So if our patent system actually worked the way that it was supposed to work, and we were only granting patents to truly innovative discoveries, then I think that is the ideal. That's the patent system that we want to create. And it still will incentivize people because you still get a profit. You still get 20 years of exclusivity, which is a lot of time, but you just don't get 130 years like some of the drugs that we see right now.
Well, the question really becomes how much is how much, right? When you look at that guy Skako who went to jail, who raised the cost of a pill $700, I mean, that's just unbelievable, and his reaction was, well, my shareholders are happy, right? And then he went to jail. We have a comment from, I believe, a physician who says, but are all Americans so gullible to fall for targeted marketing by other companies who buy demographic and other data from the good RX companies? Maybe as a physician, I falsely believe that my patients are not impacted in a major way that is profitable to those who use the data. So one of the threads in this conversation is that GoodRx also makes money by selling the data. And I guess really the question here is, does that really hurt the customer, and I don't know that it does. I mean, in some ways it might be helpful, but
I think that people care more about the price of the drug than they do about the data being sold. I would say that because it's the number one issue in healthcare, I do not know enough about data selling and buying to say anything to that effect. But I do know that, I think if you look at the risks and the benefits of GoodRx, the benefits outweigh the risks of the data being sold.
Exactly. Well, there's another comment by the same person. No, you're not interacting too much. We welcome interaction. But for the last 20 plus years after the FDA allowed Celgene to make its start in the U.S. market by manufacturing thalidomide, with the only label indicating being ENL and leprosy. Thus, they had no real R&D costs. They knew that 95% of the thalidomide would be used off-label for the wasting syndrome in AIDS before ARVS was developed.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Go ahead, Megan.
I was just going to say, it just speaks to the point that there's not necessarily a correlation between like the money invested and the clinical benefit of drugs.
There isn't, because currently the list price of 100 megagrams of thalidomide that's why I didn't go to med school, because I have a hard time pronouncing these. $116,000 a year for one tablets.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, IMAC is a really great organization that kind of looks into these patents and their correlated prices. And they did an investigation called Overpatented, Overpriced. And they were the ones who found that the top 12 selling drugs had on average 140 patents on them. But they also saw that these medicines had been on the market already for 15 years. But their prices had rose almost 70%, which is 7 times the rate of inflation. So you're creating these products that are on the market already, and somehow you're still patenting them once they're already there. So, we know that we're just these, and another thing that happens is extending the indication for a drug that was already made. And just like your commenter said, there's obviously no research and development going into that. When the drug is made and you're not changing literally anything about it, you're just expanding its indication.
So what I want to get to is basically the thumbnail of our conversation, okay? And that is that several key takeaways I have from our conversation together is that the continuous patenting is one of the reasons the cost of drugs goes up, right? Because it takes that much longer to get into the generic world, okay? And that the continued patenting doesn't necessarily mean you get better medicine. You may be better off with the same medicine from 30 years ago, and all these innovations really have nothing to do with it. I had to make sure I understood you, okay? So we're speaking the same language. I think that this was an eye-opener for me. I'm sure it was an eye-opener for some of my listeners. I honestly think people just need to be more cautious and need to read more and need to understand and not just read what's being advertised, and look into more and ask questions to your doctor. Why are you prescribing this medication for me? And why, does it cost so much? For example, there was a time when doctors were sending people for tests at laboratories they own an interest in, and of course unnecessary testing, right? And we didn't even get into what the insurance company's role in this thing, what they will pay for and what they won't pay for, because that's also a hindrance to people getting medicine, right? I know in your situation, Neda, you had a situation where the insurance company wouldn't approve some of the medicine, and why is that? Because it's still innovative.
Right. And I think that actually you can use health insurance companies as part of the solution, because part of the time they are right, and they shouldn't be paying for drugs that are ineffective. And so if you actually look at a formulary and you look at why certain drugs are covered or aren't covered by your plan, they list all these studies. It's really interesting, showing that we don't cover this because X, Y, and Z studies show no clinical benefit, or it wasn't a randomized controlled trial that proved this drug works, or there's already an existing one on the market. So they too can be part of the solution by denying coverage to drugs that don't actually work. And so it's not always a bad thing when they deny coverage. But in my case, with things like Herceptin, which is a very effective breast cancer drug, that is not a positive thing.
Well, but how do you know that though, if you're a patient? That, you know, the doctor's saying, get this, the insurance company won't. It would seem to me incumbent on the doctor saying, well, I'm going to give you something the insurance company will approve, right?
Yeah, it is entirely, or it should be doctors who are helping, but unfortunately, doctors don't even realize the ways that they're influenced by pharmaceutical companies and industry. And I just saw a study yesterday actually that showed that dermatologists who take free samples in their offices, they prescribe 80% of brand name medications versus academic dermatologists. They only prescribe 17% brand name. Because of that difference, because of those implicit biases toward people who are giving us gifts, right? It's the principle of reciprocity. So I don't think that it's obvious to doctors. I think that they mean well, of course, but they just don't realize how much they're helping drive up prices. And it's up to them to actually read the studies and to make sure that the literature supporting a drug is valid, and to help their patients, get drugs that work and won't bankrupt them.
Yeah.
We have one more. Go ahead, Allisun, Megan and Allisun. We have another question too, but we'll go ahead with you and then the question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I love this turn in the conversation of, there is this massive crisis of access to medicines and also like physician practices, but there's solutions. And that's kind of what our organization is working towards, is finding solutions that, experts have weighed in on and that are effective, and that they're backed. And one of those solutions is the Affordable Access Plan. And Neda worked very diligently at UCLA to change the entire licensing scope to try and make all medicines affordable through this licensing plan. And maybe Neda, you might want to talk about that.
Well, Neda, before you say that, I'm going to tell you, I don't want to be on your bad side, because I saw the way you handled that congressman. Okay. Okay. That poor guy did not stand a chance. And the people who are listening, Neda was featured in White Coat Rebels, and I would recommend you see it on HBO. It was on HBO when I saw it. I recorded it so I can see it again, but you go there. That guy was afraid of you.
Well, he sucked and he got voted out the following year. So I have no regrets. I'm happy he's gone. Good riddance.
Okay, that's good.
Yes.
Go ahead. What were we going to say? And then we've got just a few more questions.
So just the basic crux of the Affordable Access Plan is within licenses now at UCLA. There's a section that all licensees, or those biotech companies who come to the table, they have to write a plan for how they are going to make this medication or innovation affordable in low and lower middle income countries. So it writes into the agreement, in the original agreement, that this is something that we're responsible for and that we're going to do. And that's basically, and what we do is we work with the medicines patent pool, or the universities work with the medicines patent pool to help oversee generic production of these drugs in other countries, where, people don't have as much access or the means that we do here in America.
Well, it's a world problem, not just a U.S. problem, right? And so, I think what you're saying is basically there's got to be a way for everyone to make money, right? And there's got to be a way for everyone to get the medicine. It's just a question of how and when. Now, pharmaceutical companies. By the way, I have a number of friends who work in pharmaceutical companies. They may not be my friends afterwards. I don't know, but no, I've had them for a long time. The question is, and they always say, well, we've got this money that, there are these funds that, if you can't afford it, I looked at some websites today. If you can't afford this medicine, you may qualify for free doses, but then who's paying for that, right? It's not the pharmaceutical company, is it? It's the government or the insurance company.
Yeah, and then another issue there with these, patient assistance programs or drug donation funds, they're not the solution because, first of all, the application process is so cumbersome and complex, and you have to go through a physician to get the drugs. You cannot have these drugs sent to you directly. And so what's happening is you're creating an additional step of access for people who are already the least likely to have access to medical care. That's one issue. The second part is that these companies are not transparent at all when it comes to these patient assistance programs. So they don't share how many patients they help or what drugs they help them with. It's all shrouded in secrecy. And then the biggest problem is it doesn't solve increases in drug spending, right? So you're still setting the list price as high as it is, and somebody's still paying. And that means we're paying. We are the people who are paying for these patient assistance programs because somebody has to shoulder the cost of $100,000 pill that's being given for free to this patient.
It's almost like the Wizard of Oz. I'm sure you've all seen the Wizard of Oz. Don't look behind the curtain. Ignore that man behind the curtain. It's really don't look behind the curtain on this, would you say?
Yes, definitely.
We have a comment. If an original patent is protected for 20 years, does the original patent expire and becomes generic, even if an improvement was made?
No, that never happens. So it never expires because if an improvement was made, that would be great. Then maybe they would have a justification of extending the patent, but that's not what they do. What they do is they file a bunch of lawsuits against the generic companies to stop them from coming to market. And then they settle, and it's called pay for delay if you want to look more into it. So they're extending these through all these loopholes, I guess is the message I'm trying to get across. Pay for delay, ticketing, evergreening. These are all ways that they do it. And there's no improvements to be made, unfortunately, for the vast majority of these patents.
Another comment is, can you recommend some literature that objectively analyzes the role of the FDA?
Yes. An American Sickness by Elizabeth Rosenthal. And also any study by Dr. Joseph Ross and Dr. Reshma Ramachandran, who are at Yale. They're doing great work, and they're exposing all of these issues in the FDA and how it hurts patients and drives up costs. Because
just the inefficiency, the bureaucracies, right?
Yes.
That's going on. Again, the message from the same person as a physician: none of my leprosy patients can afford this, of course. And most do not have health insurance. So Celgene, BMS, last year formed a nonprofit foundation so they could write off this alleged cost on taxes, since BMS does give the thalidomide free to leprosy patients after digging deep into the patient's finance and insurance. Celgene was bought by BMS 3 years ago for about $51 billion, all based on Celgene's interest into the market with thalidomide. It seems like there's nothing free, right? No. Nothing is for free. Well, we are about the end of our broadcast, and I just want to say I'm going to stop the live stream. I want to thank my LinkedIn audience for listening. Stay tuned for the next broadcast. Please subscribe. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm trying to build from 5,000 to 20,000 on my LinkedIn contacts. And so I say goodnight to my LinkedIn audience. Don't forget, you are watching Conversations with Rudy Rivera.